Hello students, and welcome to lecture number 5 in our series on human biology. And today I'm going to be talking about the various terminology that we use to describe different parts of the human body, sometimes referred to as form and function, meaning that I'm going to teach you how to name all the different areas of the body, and then I'll teach you the names of all the body parts, which is most of what this course is about. And then I'll teach you the function of all of those body parts, so that to get combined is form and function. And this is drawn from chapter 33 in the textbook. All right, so as an overview of what I'm going to talk about in this lecture, we'll start out by learning some anatomical terminology. So anatomy is a subset of biology that deals with basically naming all the parts of the human body, or if you study animals, it involves naming all the parts of the animal body that you're studying. So anatomy simply means learning all the names of the body parts. There are also some unique terms that anatomists use, and as I mentioned in the first lecture, anatomy as a science, anatomy as a subject, became famous in the 17th century, 16th, 17th, 18th century, and during that period in Europe, in European history, it was expected that all academics and intellectuals would speak Latin and Greek. Those were the international languages of academics, right? So, you know, people in Germany couldn't speak to the English in English and vice versa, and people in France couldn't speak to the Spanish in Spanish and vice versa, but all of the intellectuals in all of those countries were expected to know how to speak Latin and Greek, ancient Greek, not modern Greek, but ancient Greek, but especially Latin. And so as a result of that, just about every word that we learn in anatomy is a Latin word, or it has a Latin root. So of course Latin was the language that the ancient Romans spoke. You know, Julius Caesar and Cicero and all of these historical figures spoke Latin. Today, the languages Italian, French, and Spanish and Portuguese, those languages are direct descendant languages from Latin. And so if you speak Spanish or Italian, you can probably and you hear Latin words, you probably have a good idea what they mean, because Spanish and Italian are the most directly related languages to Latin. In fact, they evolved from Latin. But anyway, I'll just be aware that the process of learning anatomy involves learning the names of a lot of Latin words. Now, if you take Biology 130, Anatomy and Physiology, that course is about nothing but human anatomy. So if you find this course interesting, you might find Biology 130, Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology, interesting, because we learn exactly the same things, only in much, much more detail. All right, so we're going to start out with learning about anatomical terminology. And then after we've finished with that, we will learn about the body tissues. So as I said, cells can have a specialty, meaning that, you know, a heart cell does whatever a heart cell does, and a brain cell does whatever a brain cell does. If you put a heart cell into the brain, it will be completely lost, because it's not a brain cell. It doesn't know what to do, and it's not appropriate. So cells have specialties. And now if you put together a whole bunch of cells that are all doing the same thing and who are all specialized to do the same thing, then you call that a tissue. And so there is a science called histology, and the word histo is a Latin word for tissue. So the science of histology is the study of the tissues of the human body, or of the animal body if you're studying animals. Right, so we will learn the names of the various tissues, and as it happens, the human body, all of the tissues in the human body can be grouped into 4 general groups that are referred to as epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue usually lines the outside of the body or the inside of hollow compartments inside the body. So for example, the skin of the human body is classified as epithelial tissue. The word epi, by the way, the word epi in epithelial, epi means above, to stand above, or to be above something. So you can see that if you have, the human body is made of many tissues, the tissue that's on top would be the epithelial tissue. So epi means above or on top of. So that's an easy way to remember what epithelial tissue is. Okay, you know what muscle tissue is. There are different examples of, there are two main examples of muscle tissue. There are three actually. There is smooth muscle, which is muscle that lines the outside of organs. For example, the bladder. In order for the bladder to contract, the urinary bladder that contains urine, whenever humans urinate, the bladder has to squeeze the urine out, and it does this because the bladder is lined on the outside with smooth muscle. The muscle that you have in your arms, that you flex when you make muscles, that is called striated muscle. And then the heart is made of a special type of muscle called cardiac muscle, or myocardium. And it is, it's similar to striated muscle. It's kind of a combination of striated and smooth muscle, and we'll talk about that in detail later. Nervous tissue means the cells that make up the brain and the spinal column and the nerves. And then we have connective tissue, which is everything else. So all of the tissues in the body can be grouped into four broad categories: epithelial tissue, muscle tissue, nervous tissue, and connective tissue. We will discuss each of those in a little bit of detail. So let's begin by learning some anatomical terms which allow us to specify certain areas of the body or directions in the body. All right, first let me begin by talking about symmetry. Right, so symmetry means that something is the same on one side as it is on the other. You need to know the word symmetry. It's a very important word. You use it in many other contexts, right? So symmetry means that one side is the same as the other. Something is, if you say something is symmetrical, then it means that it's balanced, sort of balanced, because it's the same on one side as it is on the other. Of course, asymmetrical means no symmetry, right? So the left side is not the same as the right side. The whole thing is, every part of the thing is different, right? Now there are two types of, if you have you either have symmetry or you don't. If you have symmetry, there are one of two types of symmetry that you can have. You either have radial symmetry or bilateral symmetry. Okay, so radial symmetry means if you take the object or the organism that we're talking about and you rotate it around in a circle, in a 360-degree circle, it's the same all the way around. So imagine that you had a flower vase or a flower pot or something like that. You rotate it around 360 degrees, you turn it around in a circle, it's always the same shape all the way around. So that's called radial symmetry. Humans, on the other hand, well, there are lots of animals in the world that have radial symmetry, and there are some animals that are asymmetrical. But humans are neither asymmetrical nor have radial symmetry. Humans and other mammals have what's known as bilateral symmetry. Lateral means on the side, right, to the side. Bi means two. And then symmetry means it's the same, right? So balanced. So bilateral symmetry, humans have bilateral symmetry, meaning that their left side is the same as their right side. Bilateral symmetry. All right, now when you put together, when an animal develops, like a human develops, you know, we go through a process of developing this into this body shape that happens to be bilateral symmetry. The genes that control body development and the genes that control what's known as the body plan are known as homeotic genes. Right? So there are a bunch of genes, a couple hundred genes in the human genome that are responsible for developing us into having two arms and two legs and a left eye and a right eye and a left ear and a right ear and so on. And those are a very important class of genes called the homeotic genes. And if you take Biology 234, the genetics course in second year, you will learn about the homeotic genes. Okay, so the homeotic genes are a set of genes that control the development of the body as an animal or a plant is developing. And generally, if an animal or a plant has bilateral symmetry, it's because of the presence of certain homeotic genes. If those homeotic genes become broken, in order to breakage of a gene is usually referred to as mutation. Mutation simply means that the DNA sequence was altered. The DNA sequence was changed. You know, we did that exercise in the last lecture where you have, you know, the genetic code and the codons, ACG, GCT, and so on. Something happened to that DNA sequence so that the DNA sequence was changed. Therefore, the sequence of amino acids was changed, and then the protein itself was changed. The new protein, the mutant protein, has a different function, or it doesn't fulfill the function that it's supposed to fulfill. That's a gene mutation. Now, homeotic genes can become mutated by accident or by, there are various errors that can take place when you're copying a gene. When the cell divides, you have to copy all the genes. When you copy all the genes, there's a lot of information there. So when you copy a lot of information, there's an error made every now and then, and that causes a mutation. And when a homeotic gene becomes mutated, the effects are very dramatic because it destroys symmetry. I'll give you an example. All right, first let's look at here. This is a sea sponge. Believe it or not, a sea sponge is classified as an animal. It's not a plant, it's an animal. And it is asymmetrical, so it has no symmetry whatsoever. This is a cnidarian, a sea anemone. This is a cnidaria. It's a member of the phylum Cnidaria. If you're taking any other biology courses that deal with phylogeny, but it's an animal. It is classified as an animal that lives in the ocean. Usually lives on coral reefs and things. And you notice that if you rotate it all the way around, it's the same all the way around. So it has radial symmetry. And then mammals, including humans, have bilateral symmetry. So the left side is the same as the right side. Right, now notice these words that are surrounding this goat on the right. Right, so this is these four words: dorsal. Dorsal refers to the back, dorsal. Ventral refers to the belly, the underside. Anterior refers to the front end, and posterior refers to the back end. Right? So we have dorsal, ventral, anterior, posterior. When you're talking about animals that do not walk upright the way humans do, that terminology is fairly simple. So the dorsal is the back, where the spine is. The ventral is the belly. The anterior is the forward end of the animal, where the head is. And the posterior is the back side of the animal. So if you're talking about an animal that walks around on all fours, that terminology is fairly easy to keep track of. All right, so here's a sea sponge. Lack of symmetry, it is asymmetrical. Here we have a jellyfish. If we're going to be a proper biologist, we would not call it a jellyfish. The proper technical name for a jellyfish is just a jelly, because in order for something to be, if you're talking to a real biologist, in order for something to be a fish, it has to have fins and a tail. A jellyfish doesn't have that, so we just call it a jelly. Okay, and then we have humans, which are an example of mammals that have bilateral symmetry. The right side and the left side is a mirror image of the right side. Right? And then we have a central line right down the middle, which is called a sagittal plane. I'll talk about that later in a minute. The sagittal plane, a mid-sagittal plane, is the dividing line that divides the human body straight down the middle. And then we have bilateral symmetry on either side of the mid-sagittal plane. Okay, now the homeotic genes that I promised to tell you about. Right, so here we have a fruit fly. These are pictures of fruit flies. And you may notice that normally a fruit fly, if you've ever taken a close look at one, the reason why do we care about fruit flies? Well, a lot of the genetic research that was done in the last century was done with fruit flies because, first of all, it's illegal to do experiments with humans, so you can't deliberately mutate genes in humans and then see what happens, but nobody cares if you manipulate and mutate genes in a fruit fly. And so for 100 years we've been doing lots. For 100 years we have learned a lot of what we know about the behavior of genes and the function of genes by doing experiments with fruit flies. And the technical name for a fruit fly is Drosophila melanogaster. I did a large chunk of my PhD studying genetics, the genetics of chromosomes in fruit flies. So I kind of have an affection for fruit flies, even though most people hate them. So here we have some photos of fruit flies. Now, if you've ever taken a close look at a fruit fly, you know that it has only 2 wings. But there is a gene, there is a homeotic gene that's responsible for making sure that the fruit fly has only 2 wings. And if you mutate that gene, you can end up with a fruit fly that has 4 wings instead. All right, now this picture at the top is an even more extreme example. This is horror movie stuff. This is stuff out of science fiction movies. So here we have the head of a fruit fly. By the way, do you remember what type of microscope took this image? I'll tell you, this is an electron microscope. And which type was it? Was it a scanning electron microscope or a transmission electron microscope? So in fact, this is a scanning electron microscope image of a fruit fly head. And on the left, we have a normal fruit fly. So here are the eyes, and these are antennae. These are the antennae, right? So you know that the flies, the antennae that stick out of the head, right? Having antennae that stick out of the head and legs that stick out of the thorax, which is the middle part, right? The legs of the fruit fly are attached to the thorax, right? If you mutate one of those homeotic genes that's responsible for that, you end up with a fruit fly that has another pair of legs growing out of its head instead of antennae. Right, so that a lot of people find that completely shocking when I tell them that, and it should be shocking. So you can mutate a single gene, and you can cause the fruit fly to have another pair of legs growing out of its head, as opposed to where the antenna should be. The antennae should be. All right, so the homeotic genes are responsible for giving us bilateral symmetry, and they are responsible for making sure that all the arms and the legs and the fingers and everything are where they are supposed to be. Right, so I could ask you, what are homeotic genes on a midterm or a final, or I could ask you what do you call the genes that are responsible for determining the human body shape or the human body plan? And the answer is homeotic genes. Homeotic genes are sometimes abbreviated as Hox genes, H-O-X, Hox. That's kind of a shorthand version. That's kind of a shorthand way of indicating the homeotic genes. All right, so humans have bilateral symmetry. Now, when we're studying human anatomy, we sometimes, just for convenience, we pretend that we are slicing the human body into 2 pieces so that we can look at what's inside. So we slice the human body into 2 pieces along what are called imaginary planes, right? So the 3 planes that we normally use to discuss parts of the human body include a sagittal plane or a mid-sagittal plane. The word sagittal means down the middle, running from front to back, and mid-sagittal means in the exact middle of the body, running from front to back. Transverse means cutting through the short axis of the body in the middle. I'll show you pictures of these in a second. And a frontal plane is an imaginary plane that cuts the body from left to right down the middle, but from left to right across. Okay, so a mid-sagittal plane means through the middle of the body from front to back along the long axis. So an axis is something that the word axis, you know what an axis is on a car, for instance. It's the pole that runs through the wheels. So the wheel rotates around an axis, right? So an axis is something that something can rotate around. So the long axis of the human body refers to, if you go from the head to the feet or from the feet to the head, that is longer than if you go from side to side, right? So that's what I mean by the long axis of the body. Frontal plane cuts through the middle of the body but from side to side along the long axis. And then a transverse plane is one where you have a long axis, but you don't cut it along the long axis, you cut it along the short axis. Right, so the term transverse is sometimes contrasted to the term longitudinal. So if you cut long ways down the body, that would be a longitudinal cut, whereas if you cut along the short axis, that would be a transverse cut. Okay, let's have a look at what I mean. So here Here is the middle axis, the midline of the body. And if we cut the body from front to back like so, that is a mid-sagittal plane. If we cut the body along the long axis from side to side like so, that is a frontal plane. And if you cut the body along the short axis, that's called a transverse plane. All right, so here they are individually. We have the frontal plane, we have the sagittal plane, and we have the transverse plane. These are imaginary planes that cut through the body and allow us to talk about directions and so on. Okay, so these are the three main planes that dissect. The word dissect literally means to cut in two. So these are the three planes that dissect the human body, theoretically, imaginary planes. We don't normally go around cutting up the human body, but it does happen. All right, let's talk about some of the terms that are used to indicate directions or areas of the human body. All right, so in humans, if you're talking about humans, the word anterior refers to the front side of the body, right, where the face is, the front side of the body, and the posterior side of the body is the back side of the body. Now, the terms dorsal and ventral are also sometimes used. If you are talking about animals, the term dorsal and ventral mean different things from anterior and posterior. But if you're talking about humans, they mean the same thing. So we try to avoid using the words dorsal and ventral when we're talking about human anatomy. Nevertheless, some people still use it. So just be prepared for the fact that you may hear the term ventral and anterior mean the same thing when we're talking about human anatomy. Sometimes you'll hear somebody use the term ventral side when they really mean anterior side. And you'll sometimes hear people say dorsal side when they really mean posterior or the back. So dorsal, when we're talking about human anatomy, the term dorsal and posterior both mean the back of the body. Right? And when we're talking about humans, the term ventral and anterior mean the same thing. Right? So talking about humans, once more, the word dorsal and posterior mean the same thing, and the terms ventral and anterior mean the same thing. But it's simpler just to avoid using the words it's simpler to avoid using the words dorsal and ventral altogether when we're talking about human anatomy, because the two words that we are really supposed to be using are simply anterior and posterior. Right? Anterior and posterior. All right, now when we are referring to superior and inferior, the word superior means above, the word inferior means below. As I said before, you might say, well, is the head superior to the feet when you're standing on your feet? Obviously, yes, it is. But what if you stand on your head? If you stand on your head, isn't your head inferior to your feet? And the answer is no, not if you're talking about anatomy. If you're talking about human anatomy, you assume when you refer to any part of the body, you make the assumption that somebody is standing upright and that they are standing in what's known as standard anatomical position with their feet facing forward and their palms facing forward. And so that means that the palms are facing forward. The palms are the front part of the hand, the palm of the hand. We assume that the palms are facing forward, the person is standing upright and with their palms forward and their feet pointing forward. So that means regardless of even if somebody is standing on their head, the head is still considered to be superior to the feet, and the feet are always considered to be inferior to the head. So the same is true, so the lungs are inferior to the nose. The ears are superior to the heart. That's true no matter what position the person is in. All right, now these last two terms are a little bit hard to understand, proximal and distal. People often have trouble understanding these two terms. So if you take the torso of the human body, the torso of the human body is the, if you remove the head and the arms and the legs of the body, what you are left with is called the torso. The torso. Right now, you know that the head and the legs and the arms are attached to the torso. The words proximal and distal are used when you are trying to describe the position of one part of usually a limb or something like that relative to another part of the same limb, and the word proximal means that that part of the limb that you're talking about is closer to the torso than the other part you're talking about. Okay, so I'll give you an example. Consider your arm, right? So your arm, the hand is distal to the elbow because the hand is farther away from the torso than the elbow, right? So then you would also say the elbow is proximal to the hand. The elbow is proximal to the hand because it is closer to the torso than the hand. All right, let's talk about the shoulder now. The shoulder is proximal to the elbow. The shoulder is also proximal to the hand. So the shoulder is proximal to the elbow and the hand. The elbow is distal to the shoulder. The hand is distal to the shoulder. Right, now let's talk about the feet and the knees. The feet are distal to the knees. The knees are proximal to the feet. Okay, so you get the idea of distal and proximal. Right, so proximal and distal are two terms that are used to describe the relative position of other body parts, right? And so and whether you call something proximal or distal will depend on which one of them. If you're talking about two different parts of a limb, for instance, which one you label proximal and which one you label distal will depend on which one is closer to the torso. All right, so just continuing with dorsal versus ventral. What do you call this fin on a shark? Do you know? Right, that is normally referred to as a dorsal fin, and then these two fins on the belly side of the shark are the ventral fins. Right, so that's the case if you're talking about an animal that does not stand upright. You would use the terms dorsal and ventral and the terms anterior and posterior differently. They would mean different things. When you're talking about a human, right, this entire side is the posterior side, and this entire side on the front is the anterior side, the anterior part of the body. Okay, now this diagram is taken from the side. The word lateral means the side, right? So this is what's known as a lateral view of the human body. This is a lateral view of the human body. Okay, and if you look at it from the side, you can see that the upper part of the human body has certain compartments or cavities, hollow compartments known as cavities in it. Right? Now they're not obviously empty, the cavities, but they are compartments or cavities that contain organs. All right, so you will have to learn these terms. Okay, so another term for the head, another term that is often used for the head is the cranium. And so this part here where the brain is contained inside the cranial cavity. Right? So the skull is actually, the skull, that bony part that surrounds your brain, is sometimes referred to as the cranium. And so the compartment, the cavity that contains the brain, is called the cranial cavity. Okay, now the brain continues on down the spine, so there is a small hollow compartment that we call a backbone or a backbone, and it is also referred to the inner part of that spine. The backbone is called the spinal cavity. Right. Now here inside this cavity we have the pelvic bones, and we'll learn about the pelvic bones later, but therefore this part of this compartment in the human body is referred to as the pelvic cavity. Up here we have the thoracic cavity. Right? This part of the body is called the thorax. The thorax. Right? The thorax contains the heart and the lungs. And then this part of the body is called the abdomen, and the hollow part inside the abdomen is called the abdominal cavity. The abdominal cavity contains mostly just the human intestines. Right, so the human intestines are located in the abdominal cavity. The human lungs and the human heart are located in the thoracic cavity. The human brain is located in the cranial cavity. Now, notice here, there's a little dividing line called the diaphragm. The diaphragm is a muscle that's located at the bottom of your lungs, and the diaphragm is the official border. If you're an anatomist, the diaphragm is considered to be the official borderline between the thorax and the abdomen. Right? Official borderline between the thorax and the abdomen. There are a number of things. You know what a landmark is? A landmark is like if you're touring a city or you're traveling around a city and you don't know very well, you look for a certain building or a certain statue or something like that, and then that is called a landmark. And then once you see the landmark, you know where you are and you know where other things are relative to where you are now. And in anatomy, we have things called anatomical landmarks. Right? So if you can find this thing, then you know where other things are relative to that thing, and you know where you are. Right? So the first anatomical landmark that we're going to learn about in this course is the diaphragm. Right? So the diaphragm is an anatomical landmark that indicates the division between the thoracic cavity and the abdominal cavity. Okay, so once again we have our cavities, right? So the cranium, cranial cavity, the cranium, the thorax or the thoracic cavity, the diaphragm, which is the anatomical landmark that divides the thorax from the abdomen, the abdominal cavity, the pelvis. All right, let's move on from talking about anatomical terminology and move on to histology, where we study the tissues of the human body. So as I said, all of the tissues in the human body can be divided into one of four broad classes: epithelial tissue, muscle tissue, nervous tissue, or connective tissue. Now, when we talk about connective tissue, we cheat a little bit because we can't really classify every tissue in the human body as belonging to these four. The connective tissue is a very broad category that contains 6 subgroups that bear very little resemblance to each other, with the only thing they have in common is that they are not any of the other 3, and they are usually used. These 6 types of connective tissue are usually used to connect any of these other things together, right? So muscle tissue, for example, is located right underneath the epithelial tissue, right? So if you, in the human body, you have a layer of skin on the outside, and then just under the layer of skin you have the muscles. Right? Now, between the skin and the muscles, you have a layer of what's known as fibrous connective tissue. I'm sorry, it's loose connective tissue for between the skin and the muscles, right? So there is a layer of loose or areolar connective tissue between the skin and the muscles, and so then there are other types of connective tissue that join other main categories of tissue. But so anyway, just be aware of the fact that we say that all of the tissues in the human body can be divided into 4 categories, and the 4th category, connective tissue, is subdivided into 6 additional categories. Okay, starting with epithelial tissue, it lines the outer surfaces of the body as well as internal compartments. There are actually 3 types of epithelial tissue, and we'll have to learn all of those. There are 3 types of muscle tissue. You know what muscles are. Muscles contract in order to cause movement, and that movement can be used for various things. There is smooth muscle tissue. As I said, the bladder, for example, is lined on the outside with smooth muscle, so that when the bladder contracts to force the urine out of the body, it's the smooth muscle that does this. We do not actually have voluntary control over most of the smooth muscle, but we do have voluntary control over the skeletal muscle, which is also known as striated muscle. And then, but we don't have any control over cardiac muscle, any voluntary control over cardiac muscle. The heart beats as fast as it's going to beat, and there's nothing you can do about it, right? So that means we have no voluntary control over the cardiac muscle. Nervous tissue includes two main types of cells. One type, the main functional type of cell that comprises nervous tissue is called a neuron. A neuron is the main type of cell that makes up nerves. And as you know, nerves are bundles of neurons that convey signals around the body, right? So there are nerves that come out of the base of your brain and travel down the spine and then travel out to the body parts. And when you clench a fist, it's because some nerves told some muscles to contract, right? So nerves are these little kind of wires, if you will, wiring, like electrical wires that convey signals around the body. And nerves are made of neurons, which is the main type of cell that conducts these impulses. And then glia cells are the other type of cell that makes up nervous tissue. And the purpose of the glial cells, there are several types of glial cells. We're not going to learn many of them in this course, but there are several types of glial cells whose job it is to support and service the neurons, right? The neurons are the big important cells, and the glia cells are their servants, basically bringing them food, cleaning up after them, and that sort of thing, right? And then the 6 subtypes of connective tissue. Starting with the epithelial tissue. Okay, so as I said, epithelial tissue, this is a diagram of a mammal. This is a wolf, but the same situation applies to humans. Okay, so I'm showing you the wolf because it's a better diagram than the human diagram in the textbook, but the principle is the same. Okay, so epithelial tissue lines the outer surface of the animal. So the skin, human skin, is classified as epithelial tissue. It also lines the inner surfaces of compartments. So the tissue that lines the inside of the stomach is classified as epithelial tissue. The tissue that lines the inside of the intestine is considered to be epithelial tissue, and so on. It turns out that there are three main types of epithelial tissue, depending on the shape of the cells. If the epithelial cells are roughly cube-shaped, we call that cuboidal epithelium. If they're the shape of a column, meaning that they're taller than they are wide, we call that columnar epithelium. And if they're flat and squished like a dinner plate, we call those squamous epithelial cells. Squamous epithelium. Squamous epithelium refers to a tissue made of squamous epithelial cells, right? So don't confuse the term epithelium with epithelial. Epithelium refers to the tissue as a whole. Epithelial is just referring to individual cells or something about them, right? Okay, so that's epithelial tissue. So as I said, there are 3 main types of epithelial cells. Squamous epithelium, squamous epithelial cells, or squamous epithelium if we're referring to the whole tissue. Squamous epithelial cells are thin and flat. Generally, because they're thin and flat, it's easy for fluids to diffuse across a layer of epithelial cells, and it's easy for gases to diffuse across a layer of epithelial cells. So any part of the body that's involved in absorbing fluids or exchanging gases, for instance, would probably be squamous cells. So for example, the inside of the lungs is made of squamous epithelium, because the air has to be able to cross the lung tissue into the blood. So the thinner the cells are, the less distance the oxygen and the carbon dioxide have to travel to get through them, right? So squamous epithelial cells are usually used in parts of the body where you need diffusion. Something is trying to diffuse across a thin membrane. Remember, a membrane is a thin layer of tissue, a membrane, right? So we have tissues that can be thick or thin. If the tissue is very thin, you would call it a membrane. So squamous epithelial cells are often found in the body in areas where you need a very thin layer of cells in membranes, because you're exchanging something across a membrane. Okay, cuboidal epithelium is if the cells are in the shape of cubes. I mentioned in the last lecture that only plant cells are polyhedral. I lied to you, my apologies. In fact, but the reason I lied to you is because the answer is more complicated than that. The answer is that the reason why plant cells can be square or polyhedral is because they have a cell wall. And cuboidal epithelial cells do not have a cell wall. They are square simply because of the way they're packed together. Right? So if you pull a cuboidal epithelial cell out of context, if you pull it out of the tissue, it will suddenly drop into, it's the reason it's square is because it's being pushed on 6 sides by other cuboidal epithelial cells. If you pull it out of that matrix, it will relax and go back into a round shape, right? And which they do. We can see that happen in the lab if we do that. But normally they're cube shaped because they're bracketed on exactly 6 sides by other cells, and so they end up forming a cube shape by default. All right, columnar epithelial cells are taller than they are wide. The reason that they're not cube shaped is because there's usually nothing above them, as opposed to a cuboidal cell where they often have something above them that are squishing them from the top and the bottom, and then they're squished from all 4 sides and they form a cube shape. All right, so we have squamous epithelium, cuboidal epithelium, and columnar epithelium. Those are the 3 main types of epithelial tissue. Then we have to worry about whether or not there's a single layer of these cells or more than one. Right? If there's a single layer of cells, you call that simple whatever. Right? So if you have a single layer of squamous epithelium, you call that simple squamous epithelium. Stratified means there's more than one layer. Right? Stratified means you have layers one on top of the other. Right? So if you have 2 layers of squamous epithelium, you would call that stratified squamous epithelium. If you have 2 layers of columnar epithelium, you would call that stratified columnar epithelium. Okay, then there's a third term we have to worry about, which is called pseudo-stratified. This is where you have kind of an optical illusion where it looks like there's more than one layer of cells, but there is actually only one layer. They just appear to have more than one layer because the nuclei, the nucleuses or the nuclei of these cells are located at different, either higher or lower than their neighbors, and so it kind of gives the illusion that there are 2 layers of cells there when there are not. Okay, so here we have epithelial cells. We have simple squamous epithelium versus stratified squamous epithelium. Just as an example, you find simple squamous epithelium lining the inside of the lungs because the oxygen has to get from the air into the blood by diffusing across a layer of simple squamous epithelium. So the thinner the cells are, the better. If you look down at simple squamous epithelium, you notice that it has more than 4 sides. So this is a view of simple squamous epithelium seen from above. All right, what about stratified squamous epithelium? Where do we find that? This on the bottom right here is a microscopic image of skin cells. Okay, so these are all cells. The plasma membrane of the cells is not really visible, so you can't see the outside of the cells very clearly in this picture the way you can with the picture on the left. This is actually, these are drawings on the top, by the way, and these are actual photographs, microscopic photographs from bright field microscopes on the bottom. So in the case of the squamous cell epithelium, it's fairly obvious where the plasma membrane is. It's these lines in between cells. And these dark spots are the nuclei. Right? So we in order to see these, we had to stain them with a special stain. You don't need to know about the stain. But there is a special stain that you can stain these cells so that you can see them when you put them under the microscope. Right, so remember, we're talking about compound microscopes where you slice the tissues up and then look at them. If you didn't stain them with some sort of a stain, you wouldn't actually be able to see anything. Okay, so on the right, bottom right, we have skin tissue. Right, and in skin tissue, the cells are actually develop at the bottom of the layer of skin where they are round, and then as dead cells flake away from the top of the skin, these cells migrate upwards, and as the closer they get to the surface, the top surface, the flatter and flatter they get. They also fill up with the protein keratin on their way up. So then at the very top we have what are known as keratinized skin cells, meaning that these are cells that are full of keratin. Keratin is a very hydrophobic protein. And so if you have the outer layer of your skin filled with these squamous cells that are filled with keratin, the outer layer of your skin is quite impervious to water. It's waterproof. Right? And we don't care about water getting in, really, but we do care about water getting out. So if humans didn't have keratinized squamous cells on the outer layer of their skin, we would lose a lot of water vapor. Water would simply evaporate out of our tissues and we'd dehydrate, we'd dry out and die quite easily. Okay, so next type. Okay, cuboidal epithelium. These are cuboidal epithelial cells in the picture. You usually find cuboidal cells lining ducts. Ducts are tubes that are found in glands and various types of glands, right? So for example, perhaps the only type, you know of two types of glands already. You know about mammary glands, which are commonly called breasts in humans. The breast tissue makes milk, which of course has lactose in it, which you learned about from the earlier lecture. So they make milk, and the milk is carried from the general tissue to the nipple using ducts. Right? And those ducts are lined with cuboidal epithelial cells, and it's actually the cuboidal epithelial cells that line the ducts of the mammary glands that are making the milk. The other gland you might know about are the salivary glands in the mouth, which make saliva. So, and those glands are, again, they have ducts that deliver the saliva into the mouth, and the ducts are lined with cuboidal epithelial tissue. Okay, so how can you tell the difference between cuboidal and squamous cell epithelial? Cuboidal cells look like cubes, and notice that the squamous cells, the simple squamous cells, have more than 4 sides generally, right? So if you have only 4 sides, it's probably cuboid. If you have 5 or more, it must be squamous. So columnar epithelium, you can see the nuclei here. Right? They are all attached to a layer of connective tissue at the bottom, and then we have a hollow space in the middle. This is a very narrow part of a human intestine. So the human intestine, the human esophagus, which is the tube that leads from the mouth to the stomach, that's called the esophagus. The human esophagus is lined with cuboidal epithelium. So is the stomach. The stomach is lined, columnar epithelium. So the human esophagus is lined with columnar epithelium. The stomach is lined with columnar epithelium, and the intestines are lined with columnar epithelium. So the esophagus, the stomach, and the intestines are all a continuous tube, which we call the alimentary canal. I haven't spelled that out for you here, but we'll talk about that when we discuss the digestive system. Okay, so the alimentary canal, the esophagus, the stomach, and the intestines are lined with columnar epithelium. Actually, simple columnar epithelium. There are some tissues. This is actually pseudostratified columnar epithelium, because you can see that in the regular simple columnar epithelium, the nuclei. These are all nuclei. The nuclei are always located at the same level, whereas in this tissue, some of them have the nucleus up high and some of them have the nucleus down low. So it appears that there is more than one layer of cells here, but there actually is not. There's only one layer if you look closely. So if you look closely, you see that even though the cells have their nuclei at different levels, they are all attached to the same, what is called the same basement membrane. Right, so here's the basement of the house. It's called the basement membrane. So all of those cells are attached at one end to the basement membrane, but notice that some of them don't go all the way to the top, and all of them have the nuclei at different levels. So it gives this optical illusion that there's more than one layer of columnar epithelium. Okay, so where do you find these tissues? This is a question I could ask you. I could say, give me an example of where you find simple squamous epithelium. The answer is, one obvious answer is in the lungs. Another answer is in capillaries. And when we talk about the circulatory system, you'll learn what capillaries are. But for now, just memorize that two places where you would find simple squamous epithelium in the human body are the lungs and the capillaries. Where would you find stratified squamous? In the skin. Where would you find cuboidal epithelium? In the glands, such as mammary glands or salivary glands. Where do you generally find columnar epithelium? In the intestine, the alimentary canal, the intestines, the stomach, the esophagus. You also find them inside the windpipe, which is the technical term is the trachea. All right, let's move on to the three different types of muscle tissue. So as I said, the muscle tissue that you find controlling the limbs is referred to as skeletal muscle, also known as striated muscle. And it is organized into individual little, what you call contractile fibers. Contractile fibers mean that you have some tissue that is able to contract. So if you've paid attention, you know that if you look at your own arms and legs when they're moving and the way they move, you know that muscles do not push anything. They only pull things. And they're able to pull things by shortening. They become shorter. And that is called contraction. So the individual fibers within these muscles that actually contract are called sarcomeres. So we have the word skeletal muscle or striated muscle. This is the muscle that is connected to bones and allows the bones to move around by contracting the muscles. We have voluntary control over it, which means that I have the ability, if I want to lift something up, I have the ability to consciously determine whether my arm goes up or down, right, if I'm trying to lift something up. There are other muscles in the body, such as the smooth muscles and the cardiac muscles, which we do not have control over. All right, so the other main type of muscle in the body is called smooth muscle. Smooth muscle does a lot of things that are called autonomic functions. Autonomic functions means things that the body does automatically, autonomic, and it means that we don't have any conscious control over them. So for example, as I said, the bladder is lined on the outside, the urinary bladder is lined on the outside with smooth muscle, so that when the urine is forced out of the bladder, it's caused by contraction or shortening of the smooth muscle surrounding the outside of the bladder. Similarly, food moves through the digestive system because the alimentary canal, this long tube that consists of the esophagus and the stomach and the intestine, food is being pushed through the intestine by smooth muscles that line the outside of the intestine. And so you don't have any control over how fast the food goes through your digestive system. This is happening without conscious effort on our part, and that is called an autonomic function, function. Okay, so smooth muscles line the bladder, they line the outside of the intestines, they line the outside of the stomach, and they do their contracting business, their contractile business without any effort without us having to think about it. Okay, finally, the third type of muscle is called cardiac muscle. You can see sort of a little bit of striations and sarcomeres inside here. So it looks kind of like a combination of smooth muscle and skeletal muscle, but it's actually a very special kind of muscle that contracts, beats without our conscious effort, and it beats a lot. It's a muscle that is constantly in use. So it's a very special type of muscle, cardiac muscle. Okay, so we have skeletal muscle, also known as striated muscle. It is responsible for voluntary movements where we consciously cause things to move. Smooth muscle is involuntary movements. Smooth muscle usually lines lines internal organs and moves things around on the inside of the body from one place to another without us thinking about it. And of course, cardiac muscle refers to just the muscle in the heart. So skeletal muscle or striated muscle is responsible for all of the voluntary body movements. Smooth muscle lining internal organs like the stomach and the intestine and the esophagus through the digestive system. Food is propelled through the digestive system with the help of smooth muscles that line the outsides of the alimentary canal. Cardiac muscle, it looks similar. It looks like a mixture of smooth muscle and striated muscle. In fact, it's better than both of those. These little lines that you see here that run perpendicular. Perpendicular means at right angles, or if one line is going up and down, a perpendicular line would be going from side to side. So you have the sarcomeres in the cardiac muscle run this way. And then we have these dark lines that run perpendicular to the sarcomeres, and those things are called intercalated discs. Intercalated discs. And intercalated discs are what allows electrical signals that stimulate the heart to be transmitted between fibers of the heart. So in other words, some of you may have heard of a pacemaker. If somebody's heart is having problems beating at the right rhythm, they put in a little electrical device called a pacemaker. They insert a little tiny wire into one part of the heart, and they give it, in order to make the heart beat at a constant rhythm, they give it a little electrical shock. That little electrical shock is able to make the entire heart beat. And the reason for that is because the shock is transmitted around the whole heart using the intercalated discs. So it allows the electrical stimulation, the intercalated discs allow the electrical stimulation of the heart to be propagated from one part of the heart to the other. And the intercalated discs are probably the most distinguishing feature of the heart, of cardiac muscle. It's a feature that the other types of muscle do not have, right? So if you were a histologist, if you were the type of scientist who spends their time looking down the microscope at tissues, you would be able to recognize whether you're looking at epithelial tissue or striated muscle or stratified squamous epithelium or any other things, including cardiac muscle, based on certain features that it has, right? So if you were looking at a slide and it was a tissue and you didn't know the identity of that tissue, but you saw these lines, you clearly saw sarcomeres with perpendicular lines, dark perpendicular lines, and you would probably know instantly that this is cardiac muscle because of the presence of intercalated discs. So cardiac muscle is present only in the heart. This is the bottom part of the heart, which is called the apex of the heart. You can see all of this thick tissue here is thick cardiac muscle that allows the heart to contract or to beat. Okay, so in the previous slide, I gave you some idea of where you would find the different types of muscles. We don't have to go through it again. All right, nervous tissue. There are neurons. Neurons are the principal type of cell that makes up nervous tissue. There are different types of neurons. Sensory neurons send signals to the brain from the various sensory organs of the body. Sensory organs of the body means the nose, the eyes, the ears, the tongue, and then the touch sensors that are in the skin. So those areas have specialized neurons in them that are called sensory neurons, and those sensory neurons will feel touch or pressure or heat, or the eyes will see colors and shades, and the ears will hear audible sounds, the nose will pick up aromas, smells, and the sensory neurons will send all of that information to the central nervous system, which is known as the brain. Motor neurons, think of motoring around in a car, you're moving, right? So motor neurons send signals from the brain to the muscles, telling the muscles to contract and move you around. Right? So there are two main types of neurons, broadly speaking. We have sensory neurons that send signals from the outside world to the brain. And then we have motor neurons, which basically control the muscles. The brain sends signals to the muscles through motor neurons, which tell the muscles to move. Okay, so the central nervous system means the brain and the spinal cord, and PNS stands for the peripheral nervous system. The word peripheral means around the outside edges, around the outside. So the peripheral nervous system refers to the nerves that come out of the spinal column and travel to the distant regions of the body. This is what a neuron looks like. It has a cell body with a nucleus right there, and it has a long appendage, a long thing that comes off of it. A long appendage which is called an axon, and that is what conducts the signal down to a muscle or to another neuron. Okay, this is an actual photograph of neurons taken under a microscope. You can see they look like they have one long axon, and they have a number of other smaller projections, smaller appendages called dendrites. Right, so we have one axon per neuron, but several dendrites. Okay, so the central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord, like so. The peripheral nervous system sends nerves out of the spine to the various organs, like the heart and the lungs and so on, and that is collectively all called the peripheral nervous system. All right, let's look at the connective tissue. Connective tissue can be loose or areolar, another term. So what is areolar connective tissue? Okay, so generally the connective tissue that we call loose connective tissue or areolar connective tissue is a mixture of cells and protein fibers that are produced by those cells, mainly extracellular matrix proteins. So we have some cells that are in loose connective tissue that produce fibrinogen, collagen, and elastin. And the fibrinogen, collagen, and elastin are fibrous proteins, meaning they form fibers. A fiber is something like a thread or a string or a piece of wool. We call those fibers. Right? The fibers are the threads or the strings that something is made of. Right? So collagen, elastin, and fibronectin are fibrous proteins that form part of the extracellular matrix. In loose connective tissue or areolar connective tissue, the cells that make these proteins arrange these fibrous proteins in a very disorganized way. And because the fibers are organized in a disorganized way, they have very little strength. Right? So loose connective tissue is organized in a loose manner, and it does not have very much strength. It tends to be fairly weak. It usually connects things like it connects the skin to the muscles which lay underneath, right? So you know that the skin is generally stretched fairly tightly over the muscles, and there are no gaps or anything like that. And that is because the skin is held onto the muscles with a thin layer of loose connective tissue. Fibrous connective tissue is basically the same thing, except that the fibers that the cells produce are organized in a more systematic way, and therefore they have more strength. Right? They have much more strength. So fibrous tissue is located in different parts of the body where you need strength, generally connecting bones. Fibrous connective tissue is stronger, and fibrous connective tissue is made. Structures called tendons are made of fibrous connective tissue. So tendons are the things that connect muscles to bones, right? So if you're going to move your arm around, the muscles, if you're going to lift your arm, the muscle that lifts the arm has to be somehow connected to the bone. And generally a muscle is connected to a bone with a structure called a tendon. The tendon has to be strong because the bone has to lift a lot of weight. You imagine these weightlifters who are they're exercising, lifting biceps, exercising their bicep muscles. They lift these very heavy weights. Obviously, if the muscle, the connection between the muscle and the bone has to be fairly strong in order to lift that weight. Right? So tendons are made of fibrous connective tissue, and their function is to connect muscle to bone. And then there are some places in the body where one bone is connected to another bone with a structure called a ligament. Right? So a ligament, there are ligaments in your knees. There are also tendons behind, on the backside, the posterior side of your leg. So ligaments connect bone to bone. Tendons connect muscle to bone. Both ligaments and tendons are made of fibrous connective tissue. So remember that in case I ever ask you, what are tendons made of and what are ligaments made of, and give me an example of a structure that is made of fibrous connective tissue. You would say tendons or ligaments. Okay, now cartilage is a flexible yet somewhat strong tissue. Right, so your ear, your ear is held into a certain shape. It's not amorphous. It's held into a certain shape, but if you bend it, it will bend and then it will snap back, and that's because your ear is filled with cartilage. There are a lot of other places in the body that are filled with cartilage. And cartilage is made by a type of cell called a chondrocyte. Okay, you know about bone. Bone is also classified as a connective tissue. Bone is stronger than cartilage, but not flexible. Right? So there are advantages to having a strong yet flexible structure in your body in some places, while in other places you want to have a much stronger but inflexible structure. Right? So we'll discuss some of that later. Okay, another type of connective tissue is called adipose tissue. This is fat storage tissue, and the cells that make it up are called adipocytes. So we have, we store triglycerides, we store fats as a reserve energy supply. We store those fats in the form of triglycerides. And the triglycerides are stored inside fat storage cells, which are also called adipocytes. Okay, so fat storage cells, adipose tissue, is classified as a connective tissue. All right, now the last one is quite bizarre. I don't know why on earth anyone would classify blood as a connective tissue, but I didn't make the rules. I'm just telling you what the rules are. So blood is also classified as a connective tissue, and blood consists of cells and the liquid. Cells floating around in liquid. The liquid part of blood is called plasma. The liquid part of blood is called plasma. Okay, one at a time. We have loose connective tissue. It's found in various places in the body, but one of the most common places is a thin layer of tissue between skin and muscle. Fibrous connective tissue is quite strong, and you find fibrous connective tissue in tendons, which connect muscles to bones, and ligaments, which connect bones to bones. We have bones, which are very strong and very inflexible. We have adipose tissue, which is fat storage tissue. There's not really any of it visible. So this is the leg of that wolf I was showing you earlier. We have cartilage. Cartilage lines the joints. It's also located in various other parts of the body. And interestingly, you should know that cartilage is converted to bone. So bone starts out as cartilage, and it is cartilage that is converted to bone through a process called ossification, which we'll talk about shortly. Okay, and finally we have blood. So here we have blood cells floating in serum, and that is also classified as a connective tissue. If you look at loose connective tissue versus fibrous connective tissue, you can see that the fibers of fibrinogen, collagen, and elastin are disorganized in the loose connective tissue, whereas they are laid down in a nice regular pattern, one on top of the other, in the fibrous connective tissue, and it's the organization, the regular proper organization of these fibers that gives fibrous connective tissue its strength in order to form ligaments and tendons. So here we have a close-up photograph of cartilage as seen under the microscope. We see these are not individual cells. The cells are these things, but you can see that these cells, called the cells that make cartilage, are referred to as chondrocytes because they produce, in addition to producing fibrinogen, collagen, and elastin, they also produce a very important substance called chondroitin sulfate. Chondroitin sulfate is one of the most important chemical components of cartilage. So chondroitin sulfate is a chemical. elastin, fibrinogen, and collagen are 3 different proteins that make up a typical extracellular matrix. And in this case, if you take the fibrinogen, collagen, and elastin, and you add chondroitin sulfate, you will end up making cartilage. All right, so as I said, you have cartilage, which is what gives shape and form to your ear, right? And in your rib cage, you have the ribs, which are made of bone, and then you have this central bone in the middle of your rib cage, which you commonly call the breastbone. The technical term for this bone is the sternum. The ribs are connected to the sternum, but not directly. Instead of the rib coming all the way around and connecting to the sternum, the ribs are connected to the sternum through cartilage. Right? So if you see a skeleton, a decomposed skeleton, you will probably not see this part of the ribs because this used to be cartilage, right? Cartilage decomposes when an animal dies. Cartilage decomposes fairly quickly. Bone decomposes very slowly. So when you see a skeleton, all of the cartilage pieces are missing, right? So you never saw a skull. You never saw a human skull with the ears on it still, because the ears rotted away faster than the bones of the skull. Right, so cartilage is used in many places in the body. The fact that our ribs are attached to the sternum indirectly through cartilage is an advantage because it's a little bit flexible, right? So if we're moving around, it makes sense to have the attachment between the ribs and the sternum be a little bit flexible. Okay, now interestingly, in evolution, this is an interesting side issue, but in the evolution of life on Earth, cartilage evolved before bone, right? And I mentioned earlier that cartilage is converted into bone. So when a baby is developing in the mother's womb, baby is in the womb, we call it a fetus. The baby skeleton is originally, the fetal skeleton is originally made of cartilage, not bone. And that cartilage is slowly converted into bone so that by the time the baby is born, they have a skeleton that's made of bone instead of cartilage. Okay, so bone is made from cartilage through a process called ossification. I'll talk about that in a minute. And in addition to that, cartilage preceded bone during evolution. So we started out in the ocean, you know, a billion years ago. Well, not that long ago, but 500 million years ago, we had fish in the ocean. The very first fish had skeletons that are made of cartilage, not bones. And some of those fish are still around today. So sharks, for instance, have a cartilage skeleton. That's why it's very rare to find a shark skeleton, because cartilage will rot and decompose away faster than bone. So these fish that had a cartilage skeleton are classified as a type of fish called a chondrichthyon. Why do you think they're called a chondrichthyon? Well, because their skeleton is made by chondrocytes and is made primarily of cartilage. So the word chondric or chondro, the prefix chondro or chondric refers to cartilage. Right, so chondrocytes, the word cyte means cell, right? Cyte is a cell, right? And then the word chondro refers to cartilage, right? So that knowledge will come in handy, because I may ask that on a test. I may say, what type of cells does the prefix chondro refer to? And the answer is it refers to cartilage producing cells. It refers to, or what tissue does the prefix chondro refer to? And the prefix chondro refers to cartilage. Okay, so fish that had a cartilage skeleton were called chondrichthyons, and then later on, couple 100 million years later in the evolutionary scale, then some of those chondrocytes evolved into what are called ostrichthyons. They evolved from chondrichthyons to ostrichthyons, and the word osteo or ostro refers to the bone. Right, so the cartilage fish evolved. Some of the cartilage fish evolved into the bony fish. Okay, and humans, of course, are descendants, indirect long-term descendants from the bony fish. So the humans have a bony skeleton, not a cartilage skeleton, but we have many parts in the body where cartilage is necessary. Let's look at the bones. Speaking of bones, all right, so here's the bony skeleton that humans are made of. As I said, the rib cage, these ribs are not directly attached to the sternum. They are indirectly attached with cartilage extensions. All right, now bone is organized into units called osteons. Osteons. These are kind of like long tubes that are made of multiple rings, right? So the basic unit of a bone is called an osteon. You should know that, right? And I could ask you, what type of tissue does the word osteo refer to? It refers to bone. And the type of cells, there is a specialized type of cell whose job it is to build bone, and those cells are called an osteocyte, right? So osteocytes. All right, so bone is organized into structures called osteons, and bone is basically, there is a type of cell called an osteocyte whose job it is to convert cartilage into bone. Right, so the word osteo refers to bone. So you've heard that expression. What do you call this condition where when somebody starts losing their bones become brittle and fragile, so they can become easily broken, usually because of old age? What do you call that condition? You call it osteoporosis. Porosis refers to pores or holes, and osteo refers to the bones. So osteoporosis means that the bones develop big holes in them and become brittle. Fat storage tissue. Adipose tissue, we talked about this before, so it is used to store triglycerides as an energy reserve and also to insulate the body and keep it warm. Now, if you look at adipocytes under a microscope, do you see any nuclei here? No, you can't really see the nuclei. You know, the other cells that we've looked at, you can clearly see a nucleus in the center of the cell. In one of the classic features of adipose tissue is that you can't see where the nucleus is not located in the center of the cell. But if you look closely, you can see there's a nucleus there. There's a nucleus there. There's a nucleus there. The nuclei have been pushed over to the side of the cell because the cytoplasm of the cell has been filled up with triglyceride. Right? So the nucleus has been pushed to the side of the cell in order to give the cytoplasm room to fill up with triglycerides. That is a characteristic feature of adipose tissue, right? So if I ask you what is the most single most distinguishing feature of adipose tissue, you can say, well, the nucleus is pushed to the side because the cell is filled with, the cytoplasm of the cell is filled with triglyceride storage fat. Okay, the blood, we mentioned the fact that we have red blood cells and white blood cells. So these are white blood cells, these are red blood cells. Red blood cells, the technical word is erythrocytes, which we're going to learn about later. And we have a fluid component, which is called plasma. Okay, so those are the six subcategories of connective tissue. All right, so this is our summary of histology and the study of tissues. We have epithelial tissue, we have muscle tissue, we have nervous tissue. There are 3 types of muscle tissue. There are 4 types of epithelial tissue. And we further, and then we subcategorize the connective tissue into 6 forms of connective tissue: areolar connective tissue, fibrous connective tissue, cartilage, bone, adipose tissue, and blood. Okay, now let's move on from tissues and talk about how the body is studied using systems biology. Right, so systems biology, in the old days they used to teach physicians about the body by just discussing all the things that could go wrong with every single organ. Right? And so just learning all the things that can go wrong, just randomly memorizing the name of every organ and then randomly memorizing everything that can go wrong with every organ, turned out to be a very inefficient way to train doctors. It turns out that humans, we memorize things if we understand their meaning, if we understand how they relate to everybody else, if we understand how one organ is related to another organ and how they interact, the human brain is very good at learning that. Right? So you'll find that if you're trying to memorize any list of facts, it helps if you put them together into categories to see how they're related to one another. So around the 19th century, they switched to a method of teaching medicine where they would teach medical students organ systems one at a time. Instead of learning the name of every organ, you would start out by learning the name of every organ that's involved in an organ system. And an organ system is all of the organs that carry out a particular function. So the respiratory system means all of the organs that are involved in breathing. So that is the nasopharynx, the trachea, and the lungs. All of the organs that are involved in the digestive system would be the mouth, the esophagus, the stomach, the various parts of the intestine, and the colon, right? So those, and then you would add on to that something that's called the accessory organs. Those include the pancreas and the liver, and the pancreas, the liver, and the gallbladder. Okay, so it's very often the case that you have a bunch of organs that are all involved in doing the same job, carrying out the same function in the human body. So we call that an organ system. So for 100 years or so, 150 years, it has been the traditional way to teach about anatomy by studying organ systems rather than trying to study the organs individually. So let's look at the organ systems of the body. And this is how we're going to conduct the rest of the course. We're going to conduct the rest of the course by studying one different organ system every week. Okay, so we have the integument. The integument is actually the organ system that includes skin, hair, fingernails, and sweat glands. So you probably did not think of the skin as being an organ system, but it is, right? Its job is to keep moisture inside the body, to grow nails so that you can claw things and whatnot, and sweat glands to cool off the body so you can sweat and cool. So the integument is an organ system. And the skin, the sweat glands, the nails, and the hair are all part of the same organ system called the integument. The skeletal system obviously is the bones. The muscle system is the muscles. Some people refer to those two together as the musculoskeletal system. The nervous system includes the nerves, the body, thinking, the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, and so on. The endocrine system, it produces hormones, and various functions of the body are controlled by hormones. And we mentioned in the last lecture that, on the lecture on cell biology, that that hormones are intercellular signals that are produced by one group of cells, and then they travel through the blood or through another type of fluid in the body called lymph, and they make contact with other cells. Those other cells have receptors on their surface that receive the signal and then do something in response to that. So that entire system is taught as a single unit called the endocrine system. The cardiovascular system, cardio of course refers to heart. Right, so cardio, I could ask you on a test, what does the word cardio refer to? And I'm sure everybody will know that cardio refers to the heart. The word vascular refers to the blood vessels. The blood vessels are the arteries, the veins, and the capillaries. We'll talk about that later. Okay, the lymphatic system is a fancy word meaning the immune system. The immune system is the body's defense mechanism. The immune system consists of some organs, specific organs, and also white blood cells. The white blood cells of the bloodstream are there to defend the body against invaders. What type of invaders do we talk about? Well, we mean viruses, we mean bacteria that gets into the body and causes a septic infection, bacterial infections. We also mean cancer cells. The immune system, many people develop cancer and they never realize it because the immune system gets busy and destroys those cells before it can turn into full-blown cancer. So if you just have a few, most people at any given time will have a few cancer cells in their body, but they're okay because those cancer cells will be destroyed by their own immune system. Okay, the respiratory system refers to the breathing, right? So it's the lungs, the trachea. Trachea is commonly called the windpipe. Okay, the digestive system, its job is to digest food and get rid of the stuff that we can't digest. So that includes the mouth, the esophagus, the stomach, the intestines, and so on. The renal system. Renal system includes the kidneys, the urinary bladder, and so on. The purpose of the renal system and the kidneys is to filter ammonia. Filters an ammonia-related compound called urea out of the blood. So one of the nasty waste products that is produced by all of the cells is ammonia. Ammonia is a very, NH4 ammonia is a very toxic, corrosive substance. You can buy, you probably know that you can buy bottles of ammonia in the store, which people use for cleaning fluid. And so because it works as a cleaning fluid, that proves that it's actually a very corrosive liquid, and it has a very strong characteristic odor. So ammonia is bad for you, but nevertheless cells produce ammonia as a waste product, which they get rid of by dumping it into the blood. And from the blood, the ammonia travels to the liver. The cells in the liver convert the ammonia into a slightly less toxic substance called urea. And then from there it is sent to the kidneys, where the kidneys filter the blood to get rid of the urea and send it out of the body as urine. So the renal system, also known as the kidney system, which is also known as the excretory system, because excretion means to urinate. Excretion, right? So the renal system is another organ system. So make sure that you're aware that the word renal refers to the kidney system, because that would be a good test question as well. And of course the reproductive system, that's the sex organs, differences between males and females, etc. Okay, the integument refers to the skin, hair, fingernails, and sweat glands. That is an organ system. The skeletal system and the muscle system, the musculoskeletal system, is the bones and the muscles that allows those bones to move around. The nervous system includes the central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord, as well as the peripheral neurons that run out of the spinal cord to the distant regions of the body and back again. The endocrine system refers specifically to specific glands that produce hormones. For example, I'm sure you've heard of the adrenal glands, the thyroid gland, the pituitary gland. These are all glands whose job it is to produce hormones for the body. The cardiovascular system, of course, is the heart and the blood vessels. The blue things are meant to be veins. The red things are meant to be arteries. And then these little sort of net-like structures are meant to be capillaries. Capillaries are very thin blood vessels where oxygen is meant to diffuse out of the capillary into the tissue that needs it. So for example, your liver requires a lot of oxygen. Your liver is surrounded by this kind of a web of capillaries, and the oxygen from the blood can diffuse across the wall of the capillary to the liver. Okay, so if the oxygen is diffusing across the wall of the capillary to get to the liver, the wall of the capillary must be fairly thin. So what type of tissue do you think a capillary is made of? Okay, if you guessed squamous cell epithelium, you would be right. In fact, simple squamous epithelium is what capillaries are made of. So because the purpose of the capillary is you bring fresh blood to an area of the body, and the oxygen diffuses out of the capillary into the tissues that need it. And the carbon dioxide, which is a waste product, comes out of that organ and into the capillary where it's taken away. And also the ammonia that's produced by those cells as a waste product diffuses into the capillaries and is taken away to the liver and then to the kidneys and then out. Right? So that's why capillaries have very thin walls, because their function is diffusion, as opposed to arteries and veins, whose only job is to transport the blood, right? So the oxygen and the carbon dioxide don't diffuse in or out of the blood while the blood is in the veins or the arteries. That only happens at the capillaries and also again in the lungs. So the main purpose of the veins and the arteries is simply to transport the blood. Right, now normally a vein transports blood that is oxygen depleted. The word depleted means it's been spent, it's exhausted. Right, so oxygen depleted blood is carried by veins back to the heart and the lungs to get more oxygen. And oxygen depleted blood carried by veins tends to have a bluer color, because the protein molecule hemoglobin that carries the oxygen turns blue when the oxygen is absent. Right, so hemoglobin is a protein that carries carries oxygen molecules. When there is an oxygen ion attached to the hemoglobin is red in color. When the oxygen pops off, because it's leaving, the oxygen is released by the hemoglobin turns blue in color, right? So spent oxygen depleted blood, which has exhausted its oxygen, is a bluer shade of red. It's not actually completely blue, it's just a darker shade of purple bordering on blue. Whereas oxygen-enriched blood, which travels from the lungs and the heart to the outer areas of the body, is red in color, bright red. Okay, here's a question for you. When you cut a vein, the blood comes out red. You know, like you have veins and arteries in your body, but you notice that whenever you cut yourself, the blood never comes out being blue, does it? And why is that? Well, of course, the reason for that is because as soon as the blood comes out of the vein, it's in contact with oxygen in the air, and it turns red again because the hemoglobin grabs an oxygen out of the air and immediately turns red. Okay, so that's the circulatory system. Lymphatic system, you're aware that you have a network of veins and arteries in the body, right? There is a parallel network of vessels called the lymphatic vessels. The lymphatic vessels. They look sort of like veins, except they don't carry blood. They carry something called lymph. Lymph is derived from blood serum, and it's used to reduce swelling of various body tissues, and also it has white blood cells positioned at certain points along the lymphatic vessel. Those points are called lymph nodes. Right? Lymph nodes are little tiny structures that are filled with white blood cells whose job it is to check the lymphatic fluid for invading microorganisms. Right? So that's the lymphatic system. The respiratory system includes the nasopharynx, or the nasal passages, the trachea, which is commonly known as the windpipe, and then two lungs. The two lungs are not identical, by the way. We'll talk about the differences later. So we have the digestive system, which includes the mouth, the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestines, the large intestines, and then some accessory organs, including the liver and the gallbladder. The renal system includes 2 kidneys and a urinary bladder, and 2 ducts that carry urine from the kidneys to the urinary bladder, which are called ureters. And then there is a single tube that takes the urine out of the body, which is called the urethra. Okay, the reproductive system, I think we all know about that. For the moment, it's the various reproductive organs and physical differences between men and women. Men produce haploid seeds that do not actually give rise to adult children. Those seeds have to combine with haploid cells in the woman's body called ova, and they produce fertilized eggs which develop inside the woman. All right, so those are the various human organ systems, and that is where we're going with the course from here on in. We're going to learn a different organ system every week, and that's how we will learn the organs as well as the things that can go wrong with them. Okay, before we leave this lecture, I have just one last thing to teach you about, and that is a principle called homeostasis. Okay, so when the body is running, when the human body is running, there are certain things that are kept constant. There are certain parameters within the body that are kept at a certain set point, right? So you know that your body has a temperature. Standard human body temperature, do you know what it is? It's 37 degrees Celsius. If something happens to make the body temperature go up, your body will do certain things to bring it back down again. That's one of the functions of homeostasis. If your body temperature goes down, your body will do things to make the body temperature go back up again. Again, that's a function of homeostasis. If your heart is beating too fast, your body may bring it down again, or if your heart is beating too slow, it'll do things to bring it back up. So people have a normal pulse rate, which is about the pulse rate is the heart rate. It's usually around 60 beats per minute, BPM. If it goes too high, to above 200, your body will do things to try and bring it down. If it goes too low, like below 40, your body will do things to bring it back up. You know that you have glucose in your blood. We all know about glucose at this point. you have glucose in your blood is supposed to have a certain amount of glucose. If the amount of glucose is too high, homeostasis will bring it down. If the amount of glucose is too low, homeostasis will bring it back up. So for this course, you are required to know what homeostasis is and how to explain what it is. But I'll give you some more examples. Okay, so some of these parameters that the body has include normal blood pressure, normal body temperature, normal glucose levels, and normal calcium levels, both in the blood, right? So we're supposed to have a certain amount of glucose in our blood, a certain concentration of glucose in our blood, as well as a certain concentration of calcium. And so if something happens to change one of these constant parameters outside the normal range, that is called a stimulus, right? So something happens to you that makes one of these parameters deviate or go, deviate from the set point. Right? Now, there are two ways the body can respond to this using homeostasis. One way is called negative feedback or a negative feedback loop. That means the body does something to return that parameter to its normal set point. Right? So a stimulus, one of these things went crazy and went too high, went too low. Negative feedback is when the body does something to return it back to its normal level. But there are a few cases, that's normally what happens, but there are one or two cases where the body does something to actually increase the deviation, does something to make it even more different than it normally is, right? And that's called a positive feedback loop. Okay, so there are only a couple of examples where you have positive feedback in homeostasis. One of them is during childbirth. Right? So when the baby is trying to get out, its head pushes against a structure inside the vagina called the cervix. Normally, if you try and open up this hole, it tries to close itself again. But in this case, because the body knows the baby is trying to get out, it sets up a positive feedback loop which causes the cervix to dilate, to open up even further. The word dilation means to open up. The word contraction means to close. So if something happens to try and open up the cervix, the natural response of the body is normally to set up a negative feedback loop so that it contracts again. But in the case of childbirth, if there's a baby coming out, the body sets up a positive feedback loop to increase the dilation. So some of you may have heard of childbirth when you talk about contractions. The contractions are opening up the cervix. It happens in little kind of spurts, a few minutes apart, until the cervix is open enough that the baby's head can actually come out. Okay, so the baby can't come out until the cervix has dilated, and this is something that happens. It's an example of positive feedback. Another example of positive feedback in the body is if you get a local infection of bacteria, that will cause the temperature to go up in that local area because the white blood cells that are attacking the bacteria that's infecting you, they release little bits of hormones that cause the body temperature to go up in that local region. If this persists and happens long enough, the entire body will heat up and you'll get a fever, right? So the purpose of having a fever is that the white blood cells work better, they work faster at a higher temperature. So if you have an infection, the body, there's nothing inherent about a bacterial infection that causes your body temperature to go up. When you get infected by bacteria, you may get a fever because the body is reacting to the infection. So the reason the body does that is because it's trying to help the white blood cells that are trying to destroy the bacteria do their job better. And so that's an example of a positive feedback loop. You get a bacterial infection in a small part of your body. If that bacterial infection hangs around for a while, if it persists, then your entire body will heat up and you have a fever. A fever is usually a sign that you have some kind of an infection. And the purpose of the fever, the bacteria didn't make your body temperature go up. The body did that on its own in an effort to try and help the immune system to work better. So that's another example of a positive feedback loop. So there are lots of examples of negative feedback loops. There's only a couple examples of positive feedback loops. Okay, to summarize what we talked about in this lecture, we talked about anatomy, we talked about how to name the different positions of the body, talked about how to name the different areas and regions, certain cavities and so on. We learned how to classify tissues. Tissues, of course, are layers where you put together billions of cells that all have the same function. Collectively, they form something, a layer of cells called a tissue. Then if you put together enough layers of tissue, you can form an organ like a liver or a heart or something like that, right? And then those organs are controlled by a process called homeostasis, which keeps the body functioning within certain parameters. Uh, Keeps the body function. Homeostasis is responsible for keeping the body functioning at a certain temperature, at a certain pulse, with a certain concentration of glucose in the blood being carried around to the cells, with a certain concentration of calcium in the blood, and so on. All right, our next lecture will be on the bone system, I believe, and I hope to see you there. Thank you.